Okay, back with that nice 66 Princeton Reverb with a very not nice filter cap. You can see the first video on this where I go through and discover everything that needs to be changed. And that is in the description below. There's a link to that. So let's start by disconnecting all the old wires going to the filter cap. And they're just tucked in there, no crimping. In fact, that was just tack soldered, but it held up all this time. If you're doing this for the first time, take a lot of pictures as you go or make drawings so you know where everything goes. This is not quite my first Princeton rodeo, so I don't have to document it. All right, these two 18K droppers still measure fine. They're probably fine. I'll put it to the side. This 1K here is discolored and dark. It's getting a 2-watt Vichy. You cannot get 1 and 2-watt carbon composites without paying through the nose. That metal film will be a better choice anyway. So this 1K is going to go away. Let's go ahead and lift that out while we're in this area before we get to removing the big filter cap. Now with these old solder joints, sometimes it's good just to introduce a bit of fresh solder there, just to add some flux to the mix and get everything flowing. Let me lift this wire out of the way so it doesn't overheat. Yeah, it was hooked under. You can see that discoloration. The whole thing should be that shade of brown, but it gets much darker and the bands are beginning to bake off. I'll put that to the side. It'll be returned with the amp, even though it's not being used in the amp. And I like to get the old solder out of those eyelets because I'm going to have to add more solder, fresh solder, for them to be good connections. And the more you add, the more it can pile up underneath the board. I just like to have a fresh start. This is one of the new Japanese makes, Engineer solder sucker with the silicone tip, and you can change that out if it gets deformed. It works really well. I really like it. It doesn't tend to get clogged or anything, but it's just not very big. There's a larger version I'm going to order that should remove more at once. Now that didn't get all the solder out, so I'm going to reach for my braid. Now, there's enough of a space in that eyelet for the lead of the new resistor to go into, and I won't be working blind. I know that it'll fit in there. And there's enough space here that this and the lead will fit in there, though I'm going to go in here with a bit more braid just to get a little bit more out. All right, so let me just carefully move these out of the way here. And let's see if my big iron is hot enough for the chassis stuff. Yeah. And a small flathead screwdriver. Once I can see where I'm working, the area I'm working at is looking. And work that blade underneath it carefully. There we go. All right, now that's much better. And I'm going to do that on the other three. I'm not going to show the entire thing because it's a lot easier for me to work without the camera here. But at that point, I'll get in there with some braid. And just kind of clean up that area. Because I want the new tab to contact the chassis, not just the solder. So when I go in there to reflow it, I'll have metal-to-metal contact with solder filling in the small gaps, rather than having a big blob of solder that the thing has to try to attach to. All right, that's good. For those that ask, I use a Weller SPG 80L with a big chisel tip, and I can use a large part of it if I want to heat up a lot of stuff. I can use a corner if I want to be a little more refined. Now, what I do at this point is I carefully, you can use your fingernail if you want, but that flux there doesn't take a lot of pressure to break. I like to just kind of chip it off so the big pieces are gone without scratching up the chassis. And then I do very careful, especially in a case like this where there's an ink stamp. I want to get a little bit of isopropyl alcohol on a little bitty bit of paper towel and very carefully wipe off the flux in the area I'm working at without touching the ink stamp, because the isopropyl will remove that ink. I want to make it as clean a spot as I can, again, without removing any ink, because all this yuck that's coming up on this paper towel, that's stuff that does not make for a great, reliable electrical connection when you have all those particles in there. So I like to get it clean. And again, I'm showing you one. I'll do the other three off camera, but I will have a nice clean area. And while I'm in here, I can clean up around. Anyway, let me get on to the next ones, and I'll show you what it looks like when we're done. Okay, now we're back for one of the most satisfying parts of the whole process. When I lift this tab, the whole thing will come out. I don't want to rush it just because I'm getting excited. I don't want to scratch the chassis because I'm rushing. All right, this is absolutely no good at all, but it will be returned to the amp in case some crazy collector ever wants it. Now I've got it out. I can do some more cleanup in this area, see if there's any other little bits of solder I need to take off of the braid. We're ready to put the new one in place. Get all that flux out, right up to that date stamp. All these little things contribute to the end result. Just the slightest resistance between chassis and ground. You know, if your ground's not perfect, you'll have all kinds of issues down the line. That should be really nice. Let me give it just a little bit more of the braid in a couple of spots. All right, that should be really good. Let me get the new one ready to go in. All right, CE 4 section 20 microfarad, 475 volts. Pretty standard stuff. Let's get it started. Now, to begin the bending process. Most Princetons had only two of these connected via solder to the chassis. All four were down, but only two were soldered. This one came in with all four soldered, and so the new one will get all four soldered. And since all four are the same values, it does not really matter where the orientation is in this case, as long as all the solder points line up with the old solder points. All right, now just before I solder this in place, just in case, I'm going to measure each section. They're all supposed to be 20 microfarad. All right, 22, 24, 22, 24. So all very much within tolerance. All that's fine. So let's go ahead and start to solder this stuff to the chassis. And to do that, as I mentioned in a video the other day, I use 0.031 solder for the most part, which is not a lot of solder to add for this. So I double it over, and then I double it over again, and then I'll twist it. And that'll give me an equivalent of 0.12, which is a lot of solder. And I can apply it very quickly in a suitable amount once I get it all twisted up so it doesn't fall apart on me. And this is one of the ways that I make one diameter solder work well for different size jobs. So let me heat this all up first. Just add a little bit to start the process. So I have to heat the chassis at the same time that I heat the capacitor. That's very good. Okay, I'm pleased with that, but I've got a little bit excess flux. Not as much as if I had fed in a small diameter bit at a time, but I've got a little bit more than I want. So I'm going to go back behind myself and clean that up before I attach the new leads. Okay, sometimes that flux gets a little bit hard there. I'm going to just help it out. Reminds me of like a candy shell. So it'll break off and all the little pieces will clean up real nicely. It's not strictly speaking necessary, but I like the way it looks when it's done. The old ones, you can see, still have the old flux that was all crusty on them. And that can be okay, but sometimes flux can be conductive because it's essentially a kind of glue and it just traps particles. So all the dirt, all the funk in the air over time can get trapped in that flux, making it become conductive. And if you have two things next to each other with a flux bridge between them, happens all the time on eyelets of boards. Dealing with an old Ampeg right now where that's the case. And just cleaning all that old flux off makes things a lot more electrically reliable. It's a funny thing, and if you comment on this below, I'll know that someone's actually watching this part of the video. But it's a funny thing that to make the world's coolest sounding amps takes a whole lot of boring little things like this. There's a lot of boredom involved in making something really intrinsically cool and interesting. All right, so that's the hardest part of this entire job pretty much done. I'm going to pause here, go grab a sandwich, and then we'll put all these wires back and replace that 1K with a new one and put the old 18K back and see how we did in comparison to how it started. All right, so here I've got all the wire leads poking where they were poking before. This one was just resting through this hole. This one wasn't actually going through the hole at all. It was just attached to the solder. And, you know, it's original and it held up for 60 plus years or whatever. But if it fails from Fender, it's Fender's problem. If it fails after I do it, it's my problem. So I like to give these an actual mechanical connection before soldering, like so. Doesn't take a lot. All right, so that's all there. Lift this up, and that 18K is right here. And it was originally just in like this, and I'll repeat that, how it was. And due to the lead length on this, it will just be tucked in like it originally was rather than wrapped, as I might do with a new resistor. But the mass is so little that it should be just fine. And bring to the piece. Sometimes with these things, it's actually good to tilt the chassis up so gravity works in your favor. I'll go back and do that after the fact. If I do it now, it'll hit the camera. All right, time to put a new 1K here. This resistor is physically smaller than the old one, but it is rated for more wattage with more voltage drop across it, and is just in every measurable sense a better resistor for this choice. You can also use a metal oxide or even a wire wound if you want, but I find that these little red 2-watt Vishés work really well. And in an amp like this, one of the things I like to do is I will measure the gap from eyelet to eyelet. 0.95 will do. That's one of the available options on my lead bender. So let me get my lead bender out. I'm going to go for 0.95. So I center that. Give a nice gentle bend on either side. Make sure it's all kind of neat, that they're on the same angle. Test it a little bit so I can actually hook these over just a little bit. Just want that to bend under the slightest bit. All right, now it's following the contour of that eyelet. Now I'll put the screw back because I don't want to solder before mechanically moving it like that. I want it to be clamped down and then I solder. Let me go ahead and solder this one. Put this lead back in place. Kind of also hooked underneath that eyelet. I'll come back later and dome them more like the original joints throughout the rest of the amp. But now it's time to turn our attention to the bias card. Okay, on most old Fenders from the 60s, I replace all the diodes. This one still measures fine, and so many of the parts in this amp are original. I'm going to try to keep all the original ones that are possible, but that cap has got to go. So let me get that cap out real fast. This end should just be tucked in there. It is. This end may be tucked, it may be part of the negative lead. All right, this one was tucked. On many, the negative lead of actually the positive lead of the cap, in this case the bias cap, is also the ground connection. Not the case here. So that old cap, which is a 100 microfarad 50 volt, it's not original to the amp. It'll be returned with the original parts regardless. Take out some of this excess solder for reasons stated already. All right, that cap is removed. At this point, I like to knock loose the old crusty flux. I'm not using much pressure here. It doesn't take much to crumble up the flux. I don't want to scrape up the board. I just want to get a nice clean area. Follow that with a little splash of ISO. And being mindful of the inked date there. All right. Now, we have a resistor here which sets the actual bias, and the stock value almost never makes the cut with modern wall voltages. It is at 30K. I believe it was a 27K originally. Later we'll see where that ends up, but I'm going to go ahead and put another bias cap in place. And to do that more properly, I like to remove this screw, the two screws, so that I can make sure the new cap hooks underneath. I don't want it to come loose. And honestly, it's a little bit tricky for me to do that with the camera where it is. So I'm going to remove these two screws, and then I'll show you the new capacitor hooked under, and then we'll pick back up. All right, here I've got, that's the old resistor lead there. And here's the new cap lead. It's tucked so it's pressed up against the bottom board. It'll be compressed against the eyelet. Here's the new cap lead here. That's the old resistor lead. It was just barely hanging in there, but the new cap will be solid. We'll put this back in place. Okay, I'm pleased with that. It's a nice, clean, neat installation. Should be a stable bias supply now, though I will have to come back and see what value resistor makes the cut, or whether we install a little trim pot to adjust the bias in this. Other than that, everything's looking great. I think we're going to stop this video for here. Next time we'll do the power switch and the cathode bypass caps and the power cable. And then we'll see what it sounds like. But if you enjoy this kind of thing, consider liking, consider subscribing. If you're interested in this and you haven't found this channel before, I've got over 900 videos out there, most of which are vintage or desirable amps. I have playlists, so if you want to look through vintage Fenders, vintage Marshalls, Fender reissues, hot rods, blues, various amp companies and series, look for my playlists and you can get right where you want to get. Thanks. See you soon.